Good morning. X Winterview back on his way to work yet again, like a responsible, productive citizen, at least giving the vague appearance of one. Once again, a brief dialogue for his dear friend Annastacey in his car. Where else? So, noises in the background, as usual. Apologies again for the audio quality. For audiophiles maybe listening to this, who might even be getting a little sniffy, perhaps, about the audio quality, my sincerest and most humble apologies. Today's topic, the story of my life. A very common question in the old spiritual circles, people pursuing enlightenment want to know about this thing often referred to as the story. What is the story of my life? Why is it that the story goes away, or seemingly can go away, or stops? The story, well, let's back it up a little bit. Let's not jump into this too quickly. Have a few precepts to cover. Number one, the mind, I've said it before, say it again, operates in a cause and effect context, a time-bound world of objects and space where something causes something else. That's natural for the mind. That's how it sees the world, or moreover, that's how it reports the world. Reports it, or it appears in imagination, mental internal dialogue even, in cause and effect. A this causing a that. A something doing this to a something which makes it do a something else. That kind of thing. To most people, to most everyday, the average man or woman, or child even, on the street, it seems perfectly natural. It seems that's the way the world is. That's how life is, yo. It's just cause and effect, isn't it? Well, interestingly, cause and effect is an artifact of perception. Purely an artifact of perception, which suggests that it's not absolute, and indeed it is not. However, today we'll talk a little bit about just the appearance in terms of the cause and effect-ness and how it seems to unfold for the individual. The other key ingredient, of course, as I've just mentioned then, is the individual, the point of reference, the apparent point of reference. Think about it this way. How can anything go from here to there without some point of reference? There needs to be a here in order for there to be a there. Similarly, funky word there, with time, if there's a before and an after, there needs to be a point of reference in time for that to even make sense, or for it to appear that way. I will do something later, which implies I can do something now, which might even imply I've already done something in the past, that type of thing. So there's the basics of the time-space world there. Before, now, later, here, there, etc. All requiring points of reference. But what if there aren't any points of reference? What if there is no person, no individual center to the entire appearance? Suddenly, there's no here. How could you say here? Who would be there to say here? Where would you point to and say here? Impossible. So with the collapse of the apparent individual, or the realization that the individual never actually existed, there can be the concomitant, is that the right word? Corollary? Maybe? I don't know. Collapse of the perception of here and there. And with the collapse of here and there, you kind of get everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, if that doesn't blow your mind. And of course, for the geeks out there listening, if there's no here or there, there's no space. And if there's no space, there is no time. Why? Because if there's no here or there, there's nowhere to traverse to. You're infinitely everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Not that that can be imagined, but that's just using a little bit of the old logic. So the artifact of perception that suggests time, space, etc. requires a reference point. And that's where the apparent individual comes in. I'm here. The world is over there. The dog is over there. I will go to my dog. I will traverse this space, seemingly from my point here to the dog over there, where I will pat the dog, and so forth. So that is the basis for the time-space realm, where the apparent individual seems to live. And that forms the basis for the narrative, the story, as it's called, the story of my life. And now, with time and space, we can start cleverly filling in the dots, or the points of the story, in a way. So you could say things like, I was born in this country, and this country is over there, and I'm now living here. I was born in the past. I was born 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, which is in the past, and now, because there's a reference point, I am this many years old. I am 30 years old, having been born 30 years ago. And I might live a good life, being healthy, and I will die at a nice ripe old age of 100 years old. At a point in the future, in a country over there, kind of thing. So, you can see how the points of reference start to construct, or seem to construct, this story about this person. Of course, remembering that the pinnacle, the linchpin, or the keystone, or whatever you want to call it, the underpinning is the person, the apparent individual who was born somewhere, is now living somewhere, and will one day die somewhere. And then the mind, being very clever, has an ability to reify very complex things into single entities, like work, employment. Work, for some people, is an extremely complex activity, multi-layered, difficult to describe, too boring to describe in some cases. What if you're in the world of finance, and you're a sort of independent financial person who wheels and deals currency, and then buys and sells stuff, and all that kind of stuff, and then has to describe it to someone? Well, it's easy just to say my work, my job. It's my job. You've just singly summarized an entire, huge, massive, great field of thinking with a single word. And now you can mentally not a good morning. Mentally manipulate the objects, the words, to make a story. I go to work. That's me, the reference point, seemingly traveling on my way, maybe physically or metaphorically, on my way to a job somewhere else, maybe in time and space. And that's the story, the time and space narrative, with me as a central character. But what if it is realized there is no individual self? There is no person inside the body, if you like. The body, moreover, seems to be inside the self. What if you realize that? What if that is realized, and by no one? Then suddenly all the points of reference, they don't make sense anymore. Who is there here? No one. To go there? Nowhere. Or everywhere. Where's past gone? If there's no one there, no one was born. No one lived 30, 40, 50 years. There's no now. There's no future. There's no I will in the future. There's no way to even describe it. How would you create a narrative without reference points? How would you even begin to describe the nothing and the everything that occur simultaneously, the fullness and the emptiness that are one and the same, seemingly, somehow? How would that even be described? How would it be put into a narrative? It can't be put into a narrative. So often we will see or experience people who report the loss of the sense of identity or self, kind of sitting there in a bit of a puzzle or a fog. And you ask them what happened or what's happening, and they don't quite know what to say. There's nothing to say, yet they want to report something. Now, when it comes to reporting, well, that's the mind's job. The mind comes in and describes a narrative. And of course, for the listener has to, the storyteller has to put the narrative into some structure to make it understandable to the listener. Well, I was sitting there meditating, and then, in time, I realized, central reference point, realized some kind of verb, to realize, some sense of motion, perhaps movement. There was no one there. So you, apparent reference point, realized sense of movement in time, nothing and everything, no one, no thing. Doesn't even make sense. Who would be there to realize it? Who would have the realization? The mind would report. It's only a confusion for the mind. It's only a paradox in the story of space and time, because there is no way to describe outside of space and time using the mind which exists in space and time. There's just no way, there's no overlap there. So the world of space and time isn't incorrect. It makes sense within the space-time paradigm. As long as your reference points hold true, the story, more or less, makes sense. And that's what is meant, in essence, by the story. The story of the person to whom things happen, to whom things have happened, to whom or who things will happen in the future. It's a story. So the mind always sets about describing stuff. That's what the mind does. It's like a description machine. Description machine. And so this thing that we call realization or liberation, it's not so much that it defies description, it's that it doesn't contain any referent. There's no point to which you can hook the story and give the story. The story of the enlightened person, therefore, is somewhat paradoxical. There are reports of great sages from the past, some in the present. Let's choose a fictional sage. The reported great sage somewhere in India, because that's a country renowned for its rich history of great sages. So this great sage existed in the past, goes the story. And this great sage, during his or her life, said wise stuff while sitting in a temple or ashram or in a cave somewhere. And these wise words were to people or seekers of liberation or enlightenment, of what to do or what to look at or what's what one should disregard, wisdom stuff. And the person who now hears the wisdom stuff will somehow apply it to their life. The whole story, in one sense, is a nonsense, without reference points. There was never a great sage. There was no wisdom. There's no one to listen to that wisdom. There's nothing to do with the wisdom. And there's no one there to do it, and so forth. Seems crazy. Yet, in description, it sounds beautiful. The wise sage in the Himalayan cave, glowing golden love, meditating on the deepest complexities of the world and the universe, beaming love to a difficult and troubled world. That kind of stuff. It'd be easy to dismiss it and say it's silly or doesn't make sense once it's realized there's no self, there's no reference point. But that's dismissing the world, as if the world is a problem. It's like saying the mind is a problem. This cause and effect perceptual story that the mind generates that doesn't really exist is silly. Well, yes and no. It's silly in that the story is completely empty, and there's not much to be gleaned from stories, but it's not silly in that that's how life appears. That's what the world seemingly does. And you can get yourself into a bit of a bind through story dismissal. The world becomes very flat and boring, lifeless. And paradoxically, because you cannot escape the story, at least the mind can't operate outside the story just changes flavour. The story of dismissing the world becomes the story. The story of disdain for the gross awfulness of this drab physical kind of place is now the story. So stories, seen from that perspective, are all equally wonderful. All equally mysterious and amazing. There's no hierarchy, there's no better story. The mind will obviously have its own value judgments on stories as it's heard by the mind, and of course will try and construct or shape one's personal story into something a little bit saucy, with a bit of flavour. You don't want to be too boring to your friends and family. The mind will typically pick and choose what it wishes to report in stories. Some people's stories are very negative. They maximize the negative, or they exaggerate, or they focus exclusively on the negative. And some people, it's the opposite. It's all positive. Everything's amazing. My life is amazing. I'm totally amazing. My life's going to be amazing. Even my mistakes were amazing. They were the world's best mistakes. No, I'm just kidding. I didn't make any mistakes because I'm totally amazing. That kind of thing. Then there's the story of the even, balanced person, the sort of more Buddhist, some things are good, some things are bad, some things are good, some things are bad. As if it's a more harmonious way. But again, really it's just a story. So the story continues on and on and on. And that's what happens. And even if there's no one in there doing the story, there still seems to be a story happening. And why does it seem that way? Because the mind will keep reporting it like a story. It doesn't stop storyizing. It only reports story. It doesn't have any other way to give flavour or experience or report the world. It doesn't have an alternative. There's just the story. So even for the apparent individual, we'll say, or the moment of realization, although that makes no sense at all, let's say, the story will continue, apparently. Because when it comes to reporting it, how are you going to say anything? You could be quiet, and some sages are quiet, because they know very well that as soon as they say something, it doesn't make sense, it's ridiculous. And some sages tell these incredible stories of amazingness and powers and, all sorts. It's just a story. So the story is normal, the story is natural. Some stories are awful, some are great, some are even, neutral. The story does not stop as long as the mind is bubbling away, doing its thing. There's no better story. There's no worse story, ultimately. It's all the same. And stories don't get in the way of anything. It's not like because my story is this, it's getting in the way of something better that I should be experiencing. A lot of value judgments are very easy to creep into stories, you might notice. So, when you look at your life, no doubt, it will just appear in story. It'll appear in time and space. It'll appear to have some good bits, probably, some crap bits, probably, some nothing bits, etc. You can look deeply into certain facets or elements, and you can overlook parts of the story. No one is doing that. It just happens. It just happens automatically. It comes out of nothing and appears as something. There's no agent or person behind the scenes making the story, driving the story. The person appears in the story. The person is built into the story, you might even say. The person has existence only in the story, is another way of saying it. The apparent person exists as a function of the story, as a point of reference in the story for the story to make sense, you could even say, if you wanted to. But the big mystery is that no one is doing that. There's no person behind the person. There's no mysterious, intelligent entity behind the whole thing, making the whole thing. There's just this immediate unfolding of the story, apparently. Anyway, you could talk endlessly about this subject. It's fascinating to me, but that's all we have time for in this brief dialogue. Otherwise it would not be a brief dialogue. Hope this was in some ways useful. Not a bad one, considering I haven't had any coffee this morning. X Winterview, signing out.